So, good afternoon. My name is Wendi William. I'm the Dean of the School of Education here at Mills College. And the presentation I put together is Reimagining Education in an Equitable Anti-Racist World, or Hello Future. Okay. And like all big existential and spiritual questions that grapple with intersectional and anti-racism, in 2020, I looked to Afrofuturism and the HBO sci-fi series Lovecraft Country for meaning. Itasha L. Womack defined Afrofuturism as an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. And I cannot think of a better way to position the reimagining of education that holds promise for all of our youth. Enter Hippolyta, or how Black female positionality reveals structural level need. During opening remarks for the School of Education's Black Lives Matter at Work at Week of Action, Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action last year, I quoted an often quoted statement by James Baldwin, thinking about why our current systems need Black girls. Baldwin posed the question in regard to the N-word during a interview in the 60s, 70s, and asked that white people of this country in the US asked themselves why they needed the Negro to be in that particular role. And I come back to Hippolyta. In Lovecraft Country, her roles serve others, and primarily her family, her community, her husband, and her daughter. And yet she desires, like her husband, to travel and engage adventure and be also considered a loving and dedicated parent in that world. However, the world that they're structured into doesn't permit that for her. And so though she still wants those things, she puts those on the back burner. And only later in that series and in their relationship do they have an opportunity to explore the ways in which he abused the power and privilege allotted him to get the little bit of freedom that would be available to both of them for himself, acknowledging the patriarchal portrayal that is associated with that. And Hippolyta realizes that she needs to figure out who she is in that context and beyond that. And their eyes were watching God. Zora Neale Hurston famously wrote a very prolific truism. She says, so the white man throw down the load and tell the nigger man to pick it up. He picks it up because he has to, but he does not tote it. Instead, he hands it to his womanfolk, the nigger woman. And as far as then that she is the mule of the world as far as she can see. Very, very critical to understand that this society is built on the idea of other people carrying the load. And one of the things that I want us to think about are who are our educational mules and what systems and processes, approaches require them to be in that position. I Am, another character in Lovecraft, poses a question back to Hippolyta that only she can answer, which is, who are you? Who do you want to be? And once she does answer that from her own imaginary, can she access worlds that were previously unavailable? And so my question is, what are those that we need to ask ourselves in education? Those would be, what can liberatory teaching and learning look like for all of our children? What are the material psychic conditions necessary for all children to learn well? And what are the material psychic conditions necessary for teachers to teach toward an equitable, intersectional, anti-racist world? We also have to think about the practices, policies, and resources that would make that possible. We often place children, families, and communities in the position to make choices within circumstances that really offer no good option. In the 40s, New York psychologist Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted the infamous doll test to show the negative impact of racism on Black children's self-esteem, as evidenced when they chose the white doll over the Black doll when determining which one was most nice or most kind. From those studies, we determined that these poor children were making a bad or sad choice because they did not love themselves, when really they were merely mirroring the societal lack of love or regard for their personhood, their Black personhood. They argued, and it went to the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education, that Black and brown girls, Black boys and girls would do better to be around in an integrated settings. Today is not much different. We use words like intersectionality, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, and at the same time, Black, brown, Indigenous, poor, and disabled students are disproportionately pushed out of their classrooms, their schools, their communities. So we must ask ourselves, what are the changes we need to make in our society for this child to begin to choose herself? Liberation, elevation, education. Janelle Monáe asserts in her new song, Turntable, that she's going to kick down the door, the old regime, liberation, education, elevation, that America is a lie, but the whole world is about to testify. In an NPR music review of Janelle Monáe's turntable video, Fitzgerald concludes that by the end of the song, the use of the pronouns I becomes we, acknowledging a full-fledged surrendering to a collective need to effect real change. And so we must ask, what are full-fledged surrendering to create education for an equitable anti-racist world? That would include cultivating a culture of thrivance. In addition, it requires that we think about what it means to raise resistors, educators seeing themselves as partners with families, and understanding the role of race and racism, and learning good, solid knowledge and based information that young people can use then to navigate and negotiate their lives and realities. We also must trust young people to be introduced to, explore, and navigate the world with a critical lens early. That means providing them opportunities to unpack their behaviors and assumptions, as well as to give them grace and opportunities to engage in reasonable accountability that is developmentally appropriate. And finally, we can draw in from the perspectives of leading thinkers and knowledge makers relative to ways forward. Monique Morris's second book, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, specifically speaks to practices that can engage in the saving of Black girls as opposed to the push out. And so focusing on the practices that work are the way forward. And so as we wonder what an equitable and intersectional anti-racist world can look like, what our future in education can look like, it needs to begin with the education of our youth that is critical, and that holds the potentials for realizing that future. If we want them to care and honor the humanity of others, we need to care for them and honor their humanity. And if we want to create educational spaces that create deep and embodied educational opportunities for them, we must do that for their teachers, who also need those spaces for their own thrivance. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Williams. That was amazing. You covered so much in such a short time. And the chat has been on fire with references to love, craft, country. And so while people are thinking about some questions, audience, what would you like to ask Dr. Williams right now? I'll kick it off with a question similar to what I asked Kasum. When we're thinking about, again, community empowerment, what are some of the things that we can do as individuals to help actualize the vision that you just painted for our future?
Well, coming from the field of education and the perspective of my field and our schools and our colleges, to really appreciate the one down perspective or humility that we need to take in engaging communities and young people about what it means for them to be a learner, as well as what it means for them to be a teacher and an expert on that experience. I'm a dean of a school of education, and I'm very mindful that the expertise, the instruction, the preparation actually comes from the young people in the community. And that as we begin to think about reshaping and reshifting power dynamics around who is the holder of knowledge, that embedded in there is the space in which we not only prop up, but elevate really that voice and that perspective, and learn from the young people the work and the ways in which we need to be working with them to facilitate their learning, but also their ability to potentiate their future. We don't know that. They know that. Yeah.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So we are getting some questions in. This is wonderful. Thank you, folks. How do we create a decolonized curriculum and educational culture starting from pre-K to higher ed?
I think Kasum started with really speaking to and unpacking those notions of white supremacist organizational culture, and to understand that schools and schools of education and our educational systems it is the incubator for that white supremacist organizational culture that we get every human being in this country ready for, in order to even know how to access opportunity or success, which are embedded in that culture. So it really is a more deep unpacking and I would say dismantling. I want to be honest that I don't necessarily think that we've all bought into the necessity of doing so. We still engage and play in the games and the power plays that perpetuate those systems. In many ways, it will be difficult for us to do so because we've gotten so much value from engaging in the work and in our practices that way. Teachers, professors, we like to be smart, and we have to imagine what the world looks like if we enter a space, a learning space, and career community from the place of we all contribute and have emergent curriculum that comes with, from our young people, from the communities from which they're coming from, and from ourselves together, what that looks like. What if we were all the fractals in terms of that curriculum? And I think that that's where a decolonized curriculum can drive from.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we have time for definitely one more question. Dean Kate asks, COVID is widening the equity gap in education to unprecedented levels. What can people outside of education, the education field, do to help this?
I think it's a wonderful question. And it's interesting. Education, like COVID, is one of those fields that will definitely touch all of us. We all go through school. And for those of us who are even professionals and working, as you talked about your 3-year-old with his Spider-Man fancy, I think it's really cute. We all are touched by schools because we have children, our own family members, our community members embedded there. I think what we need to do is treat the school like the community-based anchor that it is and find ourselves in there no matter what our role is. Each community member has a buy-in and a connection to that school. We're real stakeholders no matter what our perspectives are. When we take a stance that this school is of and for our community, and therefore we have accountabilities to it and it has accountabilities to us, then what we do around fundraising looks different. What we do around understanding what our teachers need and our staffers need and our leadership needs in schools becomes very different. What we do in the voting polls looks very different because it's definitely a bit more intimate rather than, oh, I have a child in that school and so I'm engaged there. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but as a community member, that school is a hub, is an incredible and necessary anchor for cultivating the next generation. And so then we should all be embedded and active there.